we can make this look even better. Hi, everyone. Very grateful to all of you for being here today and for your time. Jake Sullivan, John Feiner, could not find better people to talk to at this pressing time. Happy New Year, first.
Happy New Year
Happy
to
New
you.
Year
It's
to you.
certainly gotten off with a proverbial and literal bang. So, there you
Right?
go.
I keep saying, I'm glad we're off to a completely normal start to the year. So,
Right.
Jake, let's just jump into it because there's so much to cover. You know, President Trump has said that the US's assault on Venezuela was not an invasion because it was a, quote, law enforcement action. But can you explain for us a little bit why that's false, how unprecedented this is, and why it matters under international and global norms?
Well, first, I don't know many law enforcement actions that involve carrier strike groups and the deployment of some of America's most elite special forces at great scale with great skill. So there's the operational piece of it. But then there's the broader context. As soon as they had grabbed Maduro, brought him into U.S. custody, and ultimately back to the United States, what did President Trump do? He went out and said, now the United States is running Venezuela. What exactly that means is unclear. Marco Rubio tried to cast that in a slightly different light. But then, of course, Trump doubled down yesterday by saying the U.S. is actually in charge of Venezuela, meaning a kind of occupation by joystick where the U.S. sits off the coast, dictates to the current authorities, Maduro's number two, his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, and tells them what they expect from the United States, or else, as President Trump has said repeatedly, there will be further bombing and further attacks on Venezuela. So just in that context, what we are looking at here is something that goes way beyond anything one could plausibly call a law enforcement action. This is a full-scale military operation with the express stated purpose of running the affairs of a foreign country. And for what they're saying, quite breathtakingly, straightforwardly, is to get American companies preferential access to the oil reserves in Venezuela. So the ultimate goal, the means, and the set of threats of continued military force all add up to something that looks like the exact opposite of what you or I would plausibly or reasonably call a law enforcement action.
Yeah. Can you give me a note on why we need to care about that?
Well, I think we need to care for
unprecedented. Is this crossing a red line? Yeah.
I mean, first of all, simply going into, tell another country that they are now in the dominion of the United States, they have to do whatever the U.S. says, and if not, we're going to start bombing the crap out of them, which is kind of as simply as President Trump has put it. This is crossing a line. It's a absolutely naked form of aggression, not for the purpose of protecting America's national security, not even for the purpose of dealing with what is a very real drug problem in the world. Fentanyl does not come from Venezuela. Most of the cocaine coming out of Venezuela doesn't come to the United States, it goes to Europe. And President Trump has also showed repeatedly that he doesn't actually care that much about the drug issue, or else he wouldn't have pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted to a long prison sentence for trafficking tons and tons of cocaine into the United States. So this isn't about the American national interest. This is about President Trump basically concluding, and Mike Waltz, the ambassador to the UN, said it today, we care about who's in control of the oil supply in Venezuela. We need control of that oil supply. Who's we? We, in the end, is going to be Chevron and Exxon and some other American and perhaps international oil companies. And it's just hard for me to see how actually that is going to serve the American people over the long term. Indeed, I think there's probably a lot of folks in the American energy industry here in the United States who are like, what the heck? This is actually going to undercut us, not help us. So for those reasons, and then you have the broader picture, which is President Trump basically saying, this is my new modus operandi. You better watch out, Colombia. You better watch out, Cuba. Yes, a couple days ago, he said, you better watch out, Mexico. His staff is openly asserting at this point that, we should take over Greenland. And President Trump doubled down on that yesterday, saying we need Greenland, which is the sovereign territory of a close NATO ally of the United States. He hasn't mentioned Panama recently, but you got to put them on the list because he's previously talked about going and seizing the Panama Canal. And if you're Russia or China, you're sitting there and you're saying, okay, big countries dominating small countries in their neighborhood, we can get on with that. Let's do it. That is a world, a law of the jungle world that serves the interests of autocrats and dictators like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin very well. It is the opposite of the kind of world the U.S. built and that has served our interests very well over multiple decades, Democratic and Republican presidents alike. As you can tell, I'm able to restrain my enthusiasm for what is happening here, but I should stop there and let John at least get a word in edgewise.
I want to get to all of that, and thank you for laying the larger map and the implications of this. John, can we go back to Venezuela for a moment? Because Jake clearly laid out that the president has said that he even, I think, briefed oil executives on the plan before briefing Congress. Somebody in the administration did. So would you help us understand a little bit about, first of all, who was Maduro? There are people who are glad that he's out of power. And what are the assets that Venezuela has? Not just oil, it's this heavy crude oil. There's also some precious, or what do they call it, strategic minerals there. There's other valuable resources that the U.S. apparently would like to extract.
So Venezuela, as you say, is an energy rich, by some calculations, maybe one of the most energy rich countries in the world, although a lot of that energy has not yet been fully exploited, taken out of the ground, or accessible because they have such a decrepit infrastructure. They also have significant mineral wealth. So this is a country that has enormous natural resources. It has squandered them largely through terrible governments, now going back not just to Maduro, but to his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, who's kind of established Venezuela down this autocratic dictatorial path. So neither Jake nor I are particularly big fans of this government. In fact, quite the opposite. This is an abhorrent government that's treated its own people terribly, and has squandered this massive bounty that they have just by virtue of geography. But the problem with just going in and taking this is, one, the precedent that Jake talked about. Two, even just getting access to these minerals and this energy is going to take hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. And investment in a country that could be headed down a path towards yet another dictatorship, because President Trump is not talking about democracy right now. He's talking about a more pliant dictator he would like to install, or possibly, and this is maybe the worst case scenario, to a failed state, a government that cannot actually impose order and security and provide basic safety for its population or for outside investors. So even on the very cynical theory that President Trump is articulating, let our oil companies go in and take this windfall, not at all clear they're going to be able to execute that, particularly from offshore, just giving orders from the decks of ships, which is how we are proposing to, quote unquote, run the country for the time being.
That is so wild.
I just want to underscore, Jessica, that point, and it goes to your question. I mean, neither John nor I, and I assume not you either, are shedding a tear that Nicolas Maduro is no longer running Venezuela. The guy's a dictator. He was a thug. He was totally illegitimate. And when we were in the Biden administration, we declared him an illegitimate leader of that country. He also has been under federal indictment for many years in the United States. The issue is not Nicolas Maduro. Many of the very people in Venezuela and Venezuelan Americans who cheered him being taken out of power, removed from Venezuela, are now waking up and saying, wait a second, did we just trade one dictator for somebody else who is basically his crony, his number two? Are we now relying on that person not to deliver a better future for Venezuela, but just to serve the interests of, international energy firms and the Trump administration? They're very confused. The opposition, who actually won the presidential election, is looking around saying, wait a second, why are we getting thrown under the bus? President Trump has explicitly said he doesn't think that the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, is in any position to take on a leadership role at this time. And Marco Rubio yesterday was asked about whether there would be elections in Venezuela anytime soon, and he almost scoffed at the question. I get that to a certain extent. It's difficult to move straight to elections after a move like this, but the stated goal seems right now to be to accept just a different dictatorial regime in Caracas, based on the same ideology and with the same personnel that Maduro had, but with the separate objective of trying to extract all of these various forms of wealth. And that, I think, is the kind of the heart of the challenge as we see it right now.
Can we pull back for a moment and let people understand some of the larger frame on this, which to my understanding, it was spelled out in Trump's national security strategy, which came out in November, and it basically reframed America's foreign policy priorities as no longer being about democracy or civil liberties or even shared values, and shifting to like almost a purely business transaction. We take what we want from countries that have resources, specifically in the Western Hemisphere. So the Trump doctrine seems to say that if there are strategic assets here in the Western Hemisphere, the US must get them through deals if possible, if not through pressure, isolation, or we just saw force. Is that what you see happening here? And would you spell out for us a little bit what other countries could be under threat and what this means vis-a-vis Russia and China?
So President Trump actually said two things, significant things in his national security strategy that were in tension, and we now know how that tension has been resolved. On the one hand, somewhat encouragingly, he said the days in which the United States is going to go around intervening in the affairs of other countries should be in the past. And this is the kind of thing he said before. He's been a big critic of the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq, and rightly so. And during his first term, he sort of spoke out against the people who brought us that war. He hired some of them, fired some of them. He sort of banished them from Trumpland and from his second administration. But he also said, to your point, that the United States will have these special prerogatives in the Western Hemisphere, hearkening back, more than 100 years to this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says the United States can do what it wants in North and South America, and that other countries should essentially stay out. Now, the countries of our region, understandably, have always hated that idea. They want their own sovereignty, understandably. But we now know which of those theories has run out. Trump is doubling down on what he calls now somewhat peevishly the Donroe Doctrine, which is, again, this idea that the United States can go into these places and get access to their minerals, can tell them how they should be governing their country. And this is of concern, not just because we probably will not do a very good job of that, based on history of our determining which governments should be in charge and not always choosing well, to say the least, but also because of what Jake said earlier, which is the other two countries who are perfectly happy with the kind of world that's organized in this way, where big countries can have special prerogatives inside their own region, are Russia, which has invaded a country recently in its own region and waged a horrific war against Ukraine, and China, which is increasingly behaving aggressively and coercively towards the countries in the Indo-Pacific. And so one of the things we really worry about is what this means the Trump position will be on the negotiations that are trying to end now the Russia-Ukraine war. Will he just make this a big giveaway to Russia on the theory that, just like us, they deserve special prerogatives inside their region in Europe? And when it comes to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, U.S. deterrence specifically, which is one of the only things that keeps Chinese aggression in check in that region. Will the Chinese take our deterrent as seriously when the United States is basically saying what we really care about is North and South America?
Jake, can I ask you to take that a little further, what John just said, in two ways? One is, do you think this almost gives China a little go-ahead or permission to get aggressive with Taiwan ahead of any schedule they may have had? Does it signal to them the U.S. is understanding that what's in your region you're free to take? And secondly, is there a self-interested logic for the U.S. to try to push Russia and China out of the Western Hemisphere? Is there any positive case for that?
Yeah, so on the first question, it's been interesting to watch Chinese Twitter, because strategic voices on Chinese Twitter are basically saying, hey, if they can go in and grab Maduro out of Caracas, why can't the Chinese military and special forces go in and grab the president of Taiwan in a similar kind of brazen operation and then say to the rest of the world, tough, eat it? Do I think that's going to happen tomorrow? I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. Do I think the Chinese are going to try to learn operational and geopolitical lessons from this? Yes. But I generally believe Beijing is looking at the Taiwan question less through the perspective of what's happening in Venezuela, and more through the perspective that President Trump's overriding focus on the Western Hemisphere has meant that he's totally taken his eye off the ball of East Asia. As China and Japan have had rising tensions, as the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, has engaged in almost unprecedented exercises, in all other ways that China is exercising its muscle right now in the Indo-Pacific, President Trump is paying very little attention. If anything, he's almost giving a tacit green light to Beijing doing this. I think that, more than anything, is what's right now driving Beijing to think, hey, we may have a greater strategic opportunity to make moves, even a move of some sort against Taiwan, because of the Trump administration's posture. On your second question, it's a great question and a fair question. Yes, I can say categorically it would be a good thing to reduce and marginalize the influence of Russia and China in the Western Hemisphere. To me, the question is, what is America's value proposition to show these countries that we're a better economic partner, a better technological partner, a better diplomatic partner, and a better small d democratic partner to them? That is a long-run strategy to ultimately pursue a better strategy in the Western Hemisphere. And I will give the Trump administration credit on this narrow point, which is elevating emphasis on the Western Hemisphere as a priority. That is a good thing. The way they are now going about it, I think, is extremely dangerous. And I think President Trump's appetite for flamboyant military action in the United States, as near abroad, is growing with the eating. And it's not actually a surprise that he's saying, hey, Cuba, hey, Colombia, hey, Greenland. And I think we now have to take quite seriously that we will see further military action in those countries. And I do not see how that serves America's strategic or security interests in any way, shape, or form.
I mean,
Just
I know
can I add one thing,
yeah,
on
please.
which I think has gotten underappreciated for a very particular reason, which is the operation that the United States just pulled off in Venezuela from a purely military operational perspective is extraordinary. And Jake and I saw up close the kind of unique capabilities that the United States military brings to bear. It's an incredible tool that is available to the U.S. government, almost uniquely in the world. But the risk now is that President Trump will believe that you can do these sorts of incredibly high-risk operations. And this was a high-risk operation, sending special forces into the heart of a densely populated foreign capital and grabbing the head of state of that country, legitimate or otherwise, a protected person in that country, is on the very high end of risky operations the U.S. military has conducted in recent years, and they did it exquisitely. But to believe that you can continue doing these things over and over again without paying a potentially significant price in terms of the lives of service members being put at risk, I think is a very dangerous mindset. And the reality is those sorts of operations should only be conducted when there has been not just a ton of planning for the aftermath, and we've talked about how that hasn't been the case, but when the upside, the value proposition, what's at stake for the United States is extremely high. And what we got out of this operation, to my mind, does not justify the extraordinary risks that were taken. And I think they're learning the opposite lesson, that actually you can do these things over and over and over again and never pay any price, and that may come back to bite them.
Well, I mean, we learned that lesson the hard way. I know a lot of people who feel less safe today, a lot of Americans who feel less safe today. Jake, let me turn a little bit to Greenland, because the implications of doing what John just discussed, inserting people, special forces in to take land in Greenland, could lead to something much bigger than what we're seeing in Venezuela. Trump has said that the U.S. must get sort of the, what do we call them, the precious metals there by any means necessary, essentially. And NATO allies are warning that they would defend Denmark if the U.S. acted. It's a violation of NATO's entire purpose, and it would be the first time one NATO nation would act against another. Do you think that we are starting to see the post-World War II security order begin to break apart?
Look, a few months ago, certainly a few years ago, I think both John and I would have sort of rolled our eyes at these assertions about Greenland, and we're not doing that anymore. We're not rolling our eyes. We have to take this extremely seriously because of the relentless rhetoric that the Trump administration has pursued, right up to include the president himself, in saying we need to take Greenland. And the fact that I think, as John just said, they're emboldened by what they've just done in Caracas to say, hey, let's go do this somewhere else. I think it's important to take apart the key rationales for going to take Greenland. One is, as you just said, we need the precious metals. But of course, the Danish government, the Greenlandic government, has said, we're happy to do deals with American companies to ensure that there is a flow of precious metals to the United States, to other friends and allies. No problem. You don't need to come take our country, our land to do that. And so it's not very logical to say we actually have to go physically take over Greenland to achieve that objective. Second is that we need it to be able to place some form of military base or military assets. The Greenlandic government, the Danish government has said, no problem, come do basing in Greenland. You've done that historically for years. Let's do it together. That's called being in NATO together. So again, no reason to do it. And the third stated reason is that there's Chinese or Russian ships in the vicinity, in the waters around there. Again, that is precisely the kind of thing you can work with a NATO ally to deal with without the United States going and invading a NATO ally. And I believe that if we were to move against Greenland, it would be the end of NATO. And I think even beyond that, it would spell basically the end of an entire era in which the world has looked at the United States for all of our faults, for all of our flaws, for mistakes that we have made over many different administrations, because foreign policy and national security is never a mistake-free game, as a force for good in the world. And I think going down this road of predatory, flamboyant uses of force to try to get your way, especially when getting your way involves things like grabbing metals or grabbing oil, this is not the stuff that has made America a beacon for the world, a force for good for the world. And I think it would be extremely dangerous for us to just squander that away. For what? For a mineral deal in Greenland that we could have handed to us in a friendly manner by a friendly ally. It's really head scratching and disturbing stuff.
John, as Jake's speaking, I'm thinking about how aggressive and hostile this administration has been to Europe and to Western democracies. And there is a logic that they perhaps do want to break up some of these alliances and undermine European strength. Do you see this as a way to try to challenge Europe, to give something to Russia, almost to divide the world into three great powers, that Russia, China, and the US, that sort of take what they want in their sphere of the world?
Yeah, by the way, there's another U.S. friend that we haven't mentioned in this conversation because Trump himself hasn't mentioned them recently, but it's another country he has threatened, including territorially, which is our northern neighbor, Canada.
Right.
So,
not a small
I think
country.
Canada right now is sort of whistling past the graveyard, hoping they've kind of moved off the radar. But I suspect, they will probably come back into the discussion at some point, which is almost too crazy to contemplate, except it's not. So look, in terms of the most positive way of looking at what they are trying to do is basically they come from a point of view that I don't share, but that is not insane, which is that the United States has historically put more into our global network of relationships and alliances than we have gotten out of them. I don't believe that, but you can make the case. Their answer to that, though, is to decide that actually none of this is in our interest anymore. So we should treat these relationships not as mutually beneficial, but just as exercises for the United States to extract what it can coercively, either through the threat of military force or through the economic warfare that we are waging, by the way, not just against our adversaries, but against our friends. The trade war that President Trump has launched has affected, in some ways, most severely close friends of the United States in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, in other places, in North America. And so he has decided basically that the world is organized not according to positive relationships and negative relationships, but according to might makes right. And that our might can be applied to our enemies, but that's pretty high risk. And lower risk is actually applying our might to our friends to see what we can extract from them and put less into those relationships ourselves. I don't think it's much more complicated than that in terms of their worldview.
Interesting.
And what's really striking, just building on that for a minute, John and I have both made this observation before. Here you have a president who's incredibly cocky when it comes to smaller countries, whether they're good friends like Denmark or adversaries like the Maduro regime in Venezuela. But he's the opposite of cocky. He's almost compliant when it comes to Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. That is a pretty strange way to run a foreign policy. I would much rather have our president be standing up tough against Putin and Xi because that is where the most consequential implications for America's national security are going to come, particularly China, who looks at the divisions and the undermining of America's alliance system and basically says, my goodness, this is what we have been hoping for, working for many years. It's an asset that the United States has had that we have never had. We don't have this incredible network of allies that America has. And Donald Trump is doing our work for us. I mean, this just fell into our lap, my goodness. And of course, Vladimir Putin is rubbing his hands with glee at things like the Greenland move, because the more that NATO is talking about divisions within itself and not about a united front against Russia, the better off for the Kremlin. So I think there is a major issue here, but at the heart of it lies a president who has this kind of bully's mindset of, I can go find the little guy to pick on, but I'm a little bit afraid of the big guy. And so I'm going to cede a lot to the big guy. And I think that has created a kind of upside down logic about a lot of the policies this administration has pursued.
Jake, can I follow on that with, I like that John pulled us into a more like the positive case, or how to, pulled us away from the brink of all out global war. But I'm wondering, can you help us understand the risks of engaging countries so aggressively like this without plans, without alliances? Is there the possibility that this kind of action by the US tips us into a global war?
Well, I would say three things about this. First, I think it definitely undermines our ability to compete effectively with China. We are a quarter of the world's GDP. With our allies and partners, we're nearly 60% of the world's GDP, and China is less than a quarter. There is no way China can outcompete the United States of America if we're flanked by close friends and allies. Instead, we're thumbing our nose at India, thumbing our nose at Europe, ignoring Japan, fighting a trade war with Korea and Australia. So number one, before we get to the world war piece, just on the basis of America's long-term strategic position in the world, handing all this away, I think, is just a huge own goal. Secondly, the more you lead China to believe that it can act with impunity in Asia, including in the South China Sea and against Taiwan, the more you court the risk that a war in Asia happens. And that war would be cataclysmic. It would be cataclysmic in terms of the human cost, and it would be Great Depression plus level harm to the global economy. And so having a measure of focus and deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, which we don't right now, I do think increases the risk of a greater war. And then the third point I'd make, and this goes again to, to trying to get inside the head of the Trump administration. They basically say, we can push everyone around and people are kind of taking it. We've imposed all these tariffs and people have taken it. Venezuela's had to take it. I think this mistakes the short term versus the long term. In the short term, I do believe that a lot of countries have just said, look, we don't want to pick a fight with Donald Trump. But they're also thinking about the long term. And they're thinking, are we going to orient away from the United States of America? And if that happens for a lot of countries over time, you have a return of the law of the jungle. And the law of the jungle is what produced 2 world wars before we built our alliance system, before we built an international system that has prevented great power war for more than 80 years. And so, yes, I think as time goes on, the risk that we revert to an earlier era where it was not unthinkable that the world would be plunged into war goes way up. And I think this administration thinks just in the tomorrow, next day, the following day mindset, when I think they need to be looking over a longer time horizon.
John, let's take it back home for a minute to round things out. Back in Washington, is there anything Congress could do to slow down Trump or to shift policy? And what realistically do you think this Congress is likely to do or capable of doing?
Well, let's start with the fact that both houses of Congress are controlled by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is controlled by the president, and this is the president's policy. So on one level, the answer to your question is almost as simple as that. The Republicans in Congress have shown zero appetite, zero willingness, even the ones who we know, because we know them and we know what they've said in the past, believe that some of this is pure folly. not just on Venezuela, but on President Trump's unwillingness to stand up to China in a coherent way or to Russia in a coherent way. We know many of them don't like that. We know they're not willing to actually do much about it. So I don't have a lot of expectation that Republicans in Congress are all of a sudden going to kind of find religion because of what's happened in Venezuela. But I do think what will happen over the next few weeks is Democrats are going to do the best they can to try to get the Republicans to be on the record about these questions. That's about the best Democrats can do when they don't have power. And then a lot of this is going to come down to how this plays over the course of the next year, and more to the point, how everything else President Trump is doing in this country play over the course of the next year and into the midterms. Because unless there is meaningful oversight in Congress, which probably will require, frankly, a change of party and power there, the president will continue treating Congress essentially as a subservient branch of government, because that's how they're comporting themselves.
God. And a lot can happen in the next year before a new Congress is seated. Jake, John, anything I haven't asked that you think must be addressed before we wrap up?
No, Jessica, I am glad that you brought it to the home front, because there is a domestic context to this as well, which is twofold. One, you have a president who really seems almost entirely focused on using his military tools and toys abroad and not really focused on the American people at home, which is quite to the opposite of his rhetoric and the way that he campaigned and the way that I think a lot of his base expected him to rule. And so let's see how that plays out over time, this overriding emphasis and deployment of resources, attention, and presidential time, which is a scarce resource to these kinds of adventures. And then the second thing is, and this is quite disturbing and something for us to look for, is there are people inside the administration who have been seeking to create a nexus between Venezuela, migration, insurrection, invasion, and the use of domestic authorities to deploy the US military here in the United States. And I would not rule out that all of this emphasis on the hemisphere, at least in part, ties back to a desire by some people around President Trump to exercise the use of military power on US soil. And that is something that we are going to have to watch in the months ahead, even as we watch the likes of Greenland, Cuba, Canada, Panama, and what have you.
But you mean to to forcibly remove people who've come here through migration?
Well, keep in mind that early in the administration, the justification for trying to impose certain rules about deploying the US military domestically for a variety of purposes was based on the idea that we were being invaded. And that invasion was coming from Venezuela. Okay, that's kind of been put to bed because now we've decided Venezuela is an American protectorate. My point is that I think the overall logic of the hemispheric focus on drugs and migration ends up having an impact on how they think about their legal theories for the use of US military force on US soil. Yes, to remove immigrants, but potentially for other purposes as well. Because to them, this is all of a piece of the United States somehow being under siege, under attack, under invasion from forces within the hemisphere. And so I think we should just not have that entirely out of our vision as we think about the implications of foreign policy. We also have to think about the implications here at home as well.
It's smart. What you're saying is, in theory, it could be used to make the case that the U.S. is under a different kind of threat, which they can use to justify deployment of forces here on the homeland. That feels like a topic for a future conversation, which I would love to have. This has been fantastic. The topic could not be more grim, but the two of you give me hope because it's so helpful to have such informed, moral, ethical people who are here to make sense of it all. So thank you both, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, John, too. Thank you. I'll see you both soon, hopefully.